Hey everybody, welcome to day 4 of our virtual book study. Just a reminder, we are reading chapter 4 today. I hope you guys have been able to keep up. If not, don't sweat it. You guys can follow along at your own pace. We are reading White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And as I said, we are reading chapter 4, How Does Race Shape the Lives of White People? Let's go ahead and begin. Chapter 4, How Does Race Shape the Lives of White People? And this is a quote. White people, I don't understand you to understand me better. I want you to understand yourselves. Your survival has never depended on your knowledge of white culture. In fact, it's required your ignorance. Idioma Olua. To understand how white people become so difficult in conversations about race, we need to understand the underlying foundation of white fragility. How being white shapes our perspectives, experiences, and responses. Every aspect of being white discussed in this chapter is shared by virtually all white people in the Western context, generally in the U.S. context specifically. At the same time, no person of color in this context can make these same claims. Belonging. I was born into a culture in which I belonged, racially. Indeed, the forces of racism were shaping me even before I took my first breath. If I were born in a hospital, regardless of the decade in which I was born, any hospital would be open to me because my parents were white. If my parents attended a childbirth preparation class, the instructor was most likely white. The videos they watched in class most likely depicted white people and their fellow classmates with whom they built connections and community were also more likely white. When my parents read their birthing manuals and other written materials, the pictures most likely depicted primarily white mothers and fathers, doctors and nurses. If they took a parenting class, the theories and models of child development were based on white racial identity. The doctors and nurses attending my birth were in all likelihood white. Although my parents may have been anxious about the birth process, they did not have to worry about how they would be treated by the hospital staff because of their race. The years of research demonstrating racial discrimination in healthcare assure me that my parents were more likely to have been treated well by hospital personnel and to receive a higher caliber of care than would people of color. Conversely, the people who cleaned my mother's hospital room, did the laundry, cooked and cleaned in the cafeteria, and maintained the facilities were most likely people of color. The very context in which I entered the world was organized hierarchically by race. Based on this hierarchy, we could predict whether I would survive my birth based on my race. As I move through my daily life, my race is unremarkable. I belong when I turn on the TV, read best-selling novels, and watch blockbuster movies. I belong when I walk past the magazine racks at the grocery store or drive past billboards. I belong when I see the overwhelming number of white people on lists of, quote, most beautiful. I may feel inadequate in light of my age of weight, but I will belong racially. For example, in 2017, singer Rihanna introduced a makeup line for women of all skin colors. Gratitude from women of color poured in. Many of their tweets included the exclamation, quote, finally. These are tweets I've never needed to send. I belong when I look at my teachers, counselors, and classmates. I belong when I learn about the history of my country throughout the year. And when I am shown its heroes and heroines, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, Amelia Earhart, Susan B. Anthony, John Glenn, Sally Ride, and Louisa May Alcott, I belong when I look through my textbooks and at the pictures of my classroom walls. I belong when I speak to my children's teachers, when I talk to their camp counselors, when I consult with their doctors and dentists. No matter how I might explain why all these representations are overwhelmingly white, they still shape my identity and worldview. In virtually every situation or context deemed normal, neutral, or prestigious in society, I belong racially. This belonging is a deep and ever-present feeling that has always been with me. Belonging has settled deep into my consciousness. It shapes my daily thoughts and concerns, what I reach for in life, and what I expect to find. The experience of belonging is so natural that I do not have to think about it. The rare moments in which I don't belong racially come as a surprise that I can either enjoy for its novelty or easily avoid if I find it unsettling. For example, I was invited to the retirement party of a white friend. The party was a potluck picnic held in a public park. As I walked down the slope toward the picnic shelters, I noticed two parties going on side by side. One gathering with primarily composed of white people, and the other appeared to be all black people. I experienced a sense of disequilibrium as I approached and had to choose which party was my friend's. I felt a mild sense of anxiety as I considered that I might have to enter an all-black group. Then mild relief as I realized that my friend was in the other group. This relief was amplified as I thought that I might have mistakenly walked over to the black party. All these thoughts and feelings happened in just a few seconds, but they were a rare moment of racial self-awareness. The mere possibility that I might have to experience not belonging racially was enough to raise racial discomfort. It is rare for me to experience a sense of not belonging racially, and these are usually very temporary, easily avoidable situations. Indeed, throughout my life, I have been warned that I should avoid situations in which I might be a racial minority. These situations are often presented as scary, dangerous, or, quote, sketchy. Yet, if the environment or situation is viewed as good, nice, or valuable, I can be confident that as a white person, I will be seen as racially belonging there. Freedom from the burden of race. Because I haven't been socialized to see myself or to be seen by other whites in racial terms, I don't carry the psychic weight of race. I don't have to worry about how others feel about my race, nor do I worry that my race will be held against me. While I may feel unease in an upper-class environment, I will take for granted that I belong racially in these settings. I certainly will not be the only white person there, unless the event is specifically organized by or celebrating people of color. George Zimmerman would not have stopped me as I walked through a gated suburban neighborhood. Patrick Rosal writes poignantly about the pain of being mistaken for the help at a black tie event celebrating National Book Award winners. I have witnessed this assumption of servitude many times as I checked into hotels with colleagues of color. I have made this assumption myself when I have been unable to hide my surprise that the black man is the school principal, or when I ask a Latinx woman kneeling in her garden if this is her home. As I consider career choices, I will have countless role models across a vast array of fields. When I apply for a job, virtually anyone in the position to hire me will share my race. And although I may encounter a token person of color during the hiring process, if I'm not specifically applying to an organization founded by people of color, the majority of those I interact with will share my race. Once hired, I won't have to deal with my coworkers' resentment that I only got the job because I am white. I am assumed to be the most qualified. If there are people of color in the organization who resent my hire, I can easily dismiss them and rest assured that their feelings won't carry much weight. If resentment from employees of color does manage to come to my attention, I can find copious validation and other support from my white coworkers who will reassure me that our colleagues of color are the ones who are biased. With race as a non-issue, I can focus on my work and productivity and be seen as a team player. This is yet another example of the concept of whiteness as a property discussed earlier. Whiteness has psychological advantages that translate into material returns. As I move through my day, racism just isn't my problem. While I am aware that race has been used unfairly against people of color, I haven't been taught to see this problem as any responsibility of mine. As long as I personally haven't done anything I am aware of, racism is a non-issue. This freedom from responsibility gives me a level of racial relaxation and emotional and intellectual space that people of color are not afforded as they move through their day. They don't lack these benefits just because they are members of a numerical minority, and I am not, quote, white men as a numerical minority. People of color lack these benefits because they are racialized within a culture of white supremacy, a culture in which they are seen as inferior, if they are seen at all. Raised in a culture of white supremacy, I exude a deeply internalized assumption of racial superiority. Having to navigate white people's internalized assumption of racial superiority is a great psychic drain for people of color, but I have no need to concern myself with that. Freedom of movement. I am free to move in virtually any space seen as normal, neutral, or valuable. While I might worry about my class status in some settings, for example, when attending a quote high society event, such as a museum opening or an art auction, I will not have to worry about my race. In fact, my race will work in my favor in these settings, granting me the initial benefit of the doubt that I belong there. I also will certainly not be the only white person there unless the event is specifically organized by or celebrating people of color. In the early years of my career as a workplace diversity trainer, I co-led the workshops with Deborah, an African American woman. After a particularly grueling travel schedule, I proposed that we get away for a relaxing weekend and suggested Lake Coeur d'Alene in Idaho. Deborah laughed at the suggestion and let me know that the visiting northern Idaho did not sound like a relaxing weekend for her. Besides being a very small town, Lake Coeur d'Alene is near Hayden Lake, where the Aryan Nation was building a compound. Although not all people who live in the area are avowed white nationalists, the knowledge that some people might be part of this openly racist group was terrifying for Deborah, even if there was no organized white nationalist encampments in the area. Deborah did not want to be isolated in a virtually all-white environment and have to interact with white people who may have never met a black person before. Yet, as a white person, I did not have to consider any of this. All places I perceive as beautiful are open to me racially, and my expectation is that I will have a pleasant and relaxing experience there. Just people. Another way that my life has been shaped by being white is that my race is held up as the norm for humanity. Whites are, quote, just people. Our race is rarely, if ever, named. Think about how often white people mention the race of a person if they are not white. My black friend, the Asian woman. I enjoy young adult literature, but am taken aback by how consistently the race of characters of color is named and how only those characters' races are named. To use an example from school, consider the writers we were all expected to read. The list usually includes Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, Charles Dickens, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Mark Twain, Jane Austen, and William Shakespeare. These writers are seen as representing the universal human experience, and we read them precisely because they are presumed to be able to speak to all of us. Now consider the writers we turn to during events promoting diversity, events such as Multicultural Authors Week and Black History Month. These writers usually include Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Amy Tan, and Sandra Cisneros. We go to these writers for the black or Asian perspective. Toni Morrison is always seen as a black writer, not just a writer. But when we are not looking for the black or Asian perspective, we return to white writers, reinforcing the idea of whites as just human, and people of color as particular kinds, racialized of humans. This also allows white, male writers to be seen as not having an agenda or any particular perspective, while racialized and gendered writers do. Virtually any representation of human is based on white people's norms and images. Quote, flesh-colored makeup, standard emoji, depictions of Adam and Eve, Jesus and Mary, educational models of the human body with white skin and blue eyes. Take, for example, a photograph that was circulated widely and featured in the Daily Mail. The photo of a blonde, blue-eyed white woman is captioned, "What would a scientifically perfect face look like?" Below, the image is the question, is this the perfect face? This one example illustrates several concepts discussed thus far. The white racial frame, whiteness as the human norm, whiteness as ideal beauty, and whiteness as naturally superior. Not only is the idea behind the claim racially problematic in its own right, but it rests on and reinforces the backdrop of an earlier era of scientific racism. Consider models for child development and its stages, and how our culture talks about children as a collective group. Theorists present human development as if it were universal. Occasionally, we may distinguish between boys and girls, but even then, the categories are presumed to include all boys or all girls. Now consider all the dynamics I have discussed thus far. Is an Asian or an indigenous child's development the same as a white child's within the context of white supremacy? White solidarity. White solidarity is the unspoken agreement among whites to protect white advantage and not cause another white person to feel racial discomfort by confronting them when they say or do something racially problematic. I want to read that again because that's a really, really important concept. White solidarity is the unspoken agreement among whites to protect white advantage and not cause another white person to feel racial discomfort by confronting them when they say or do something racially problematic. Educational researcher Christine Sleeter describes this solidarity as white, quote, racial bonding. She observed that when whites interact, they affirm a, quote, a common stance on race-related issues, legitimating particular interpretations of groups of color and drawing conspiratorial we-they boundaries. White solidarity requires both silence about anything that exposes the advantages of the white position and tacit, meaning implied but not stated, agreement to remain racially united in the protection of white supremacy. To break white solidarity is to break rank. We see white solidarity as the dinner table, at parties, and in work settings. Many of us can relate to the big family dinner at which Uncle Bob says something racially offensive. Everyone cringes, but no one challenges him because nobody wants to ruin the dinner. Or the party where someone tells a racist joke, but we keep silent because we don't want to be accused of being too politically correct or be told to lighten up. In the workplace, we avoid naming racism for the same reasons. In addition to wanting to be seen as a team player and to avoid anything that may jeopardize our career advancement, all these familiar scenarios are examples of white solidarity. Why speaking up about racism would ruin the ambience or threaten our career advancement is something we might want to talk about. The very real consequences of breaking white solidarity play a fundamental role in maintaining white supremacy. We do indeed risk censure and other penalties from our fellow whites. We might be accused of being politically correct, or might be perceived as angry, humorless, combative, and not suited to go far in an organization. In my own life, these penalties have worked as a form of social coercion, seeking to avoid conflict and wanting to be liked. I have chosen silence all too often. Conversely, when I kept quiet about racism, I was rewarded with social capital, such as being seen as fun, cooperative, and a team player. Notice that when within a white supremacist society, I'm rewarded for not interrupting racism, and punished in a range of ways, big and small, when I do. I can justify my silence by telling myself that at least I am not the one who made the joke, and that therefore I am not at fault. But my silence is not benign, because it protects and maintains the racial hierarchy and my place within it. Each uninterrupted joke furthers the circulation of racism through the culture, and the ability for the joke to circulate depends on my complicity. People of color certainly experience white solidarity as a form of racism, wherein we fail to hold each other accountable to challenge racism when we see it, or to support people of color in the struggle for racial justice. The good old days. As a white person, I can openly and unabashedly reminisce about, quote, the good old days. Romanticized recollections of the past and calls for a return to former ways of a function of white privilege, which manifests itself in the ability to remain oblivious to our racial history. Claiming that the past was socially better than the present is also a hallmark of white supremacy. Consider any period in the past from the perspective of people of color. 246 years of brutal enslavement, the rape of black women for the pleasure of white men, and produced more enslaved workers, the selling off of black children, the attempted genocide of indigenous people, Indian removal acts and reservations, indentured servitude, lynching, and mob violence, sharecropping, Chinese exclusion laws, Japanese American internment, Jim Crow laws of mandatory segregation, black codes, bans on black jury services, bans on voting, imprisoning people for unpaid work, medical sterilization and experimentation, employment discrimination, educational discrimination, inferior schools, biased laws, and policing practices, redlining and subprime mortgages, mass incarceration, racist media representations, cultural erasures, attacks and mockery, and untold and perverted historical accounts. And you can see how a romanticized past is strictly a white construct. But it is a powerful construct because it calls out to a deeply internalized sense of superiority and entitlement, and the sense that an advancement for people of color is an encroachment on this entitlement. The past was great for white people, and white men in particular, because their positions went largely unchallenged. In understanding the power of white fragility, we have to notice that the mere questioning of those positions triggered the white fragility that Trump capitalized on. There have been no actual loss of power for the white elite, who have always controlled our institutions and continue to do so via a very wide margin. Of the 50 richest people on earth, 29 are American. Of these 29, all are white, and all but 2 are men. Lauren Jobs inherited her husband's wealth, and Allison Walton's her father's. Similarly, the white working class has always held the top positions within blue-collared fields, the overseers, labor leaders, and fire and police chiefs. And although globalization and the erosion of workers' rights has had a profound impact on the white working class, white fragility enabled the white elite to direct the white working class's resentment toward people of color. The resentment is clearly misdirected given that the people who control the economy and who have managed to concentrate more wealth into fewer white hands than ever before in human history are the white elite. Consider this data on the distribution of wealth. Since 2015, the richest 1% has owned more wealth than the rest of the planet owns. 8 men own the same amount of wealth as do the poorest half of the world. The income of the poorest 10% of people increased by less than $3 a year between 1988 and 2011, while the incomes of the richest 1% increased 182 times as much. In Bloomberg's daily ranking of the world's 500 richest people, the world's wealthiest 3, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Jeff Bezos, all white American men, have total net worths of $85 billion, $79 billion, and $73 billion, respectively. By comparison, the 2015 gross domestic product of Sri Lanka was $82 billion, Luxembourg $58 billion, and Iceland $16 billion. Of the world's 10 richest people, 9 are white men. In 2015 to 2016, the world's 10 biggest corporations together had revenue greater than that of the government revenue of 180 countries combined. In the U.S., over the last 30 years, the growth in the incomes of the bottom 50% has been 0, whereas incomes of the top 1% have grown by 300%. If those numbers don't shock you, then something is not right. The call to make America great again worked powerfully in the service of the racial manipulation of white people, diverting blame away from the white elite and toward various people of color. For example, undocumented workers, immigrants, and the Chinese for the current conditions of the white working class. The romanticized, quote, traditional family values of the past are also racially problematic. White families fled from cities to the suburbs to escape the influx of people of color, a process sociologists called and termed white flight. They wrote covenants to keep schools and neighborhoods segregated and forbade cross-racial dating. Consider the extreme resistance to busing and other forms of social integration from white parents. In the landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education, the court ruled that separate was inherently unequal and that schools needed to desegregate, quote, with all deliberate speed. Busing children from one neighborhood into a school in another to account for residential segregation became a major strategy of desegregation. Notably, white children were generally not bused into predominantly black schools. Instead, black children endured long bus rides to attend predominantly white schools. Regina Williams, a black student from Roxbury, Massachusetts, was bused into a school in South Boston. She described her first day in a formerly all-white school as, quote, like a war zone. School officials, politicians, and courts and the media gave precedence to the desires of white parents who overwhelmingly and vehemently opposed school desegregation. It has not been African Americans who resist integration efforts. It has always been whites. The practice of our lives as a white collective has rarely been an ailment with the values we profess. At the minimum, the idealization of the past is another example of white experiences and perceptions positioned as universal. How might this nostalgia sound to any person of color who is aware of the country's history? The ability to erase this racial history and actually believe that the past was better than the present, quote, for everybody, has inculcated a false consciousness for me personally as a national citizen. White racial innocence. Because we are not raised to see ourselves in racial terms or to see white space as a racialized space, we position ourselves as innocent of race. On countless occasions, I have heard white people claim that because they grew up in segregation, they were sheltered from race. At the same time, we turn to people of color who may also have grown up in a racially segregated space because of decades of de jure and de facto policies that blocked them from moving into white neighborhoods to learn about racism. But why aren't people of color who grew up in segregation also innocent of race? I ask my readers to reflect deeply on the idea that white segregation is racially innocent. Because people of color are not seen as racially innocent, they are expected to speak to issues of race, but must do so on white terms. This idea that racism is not a white problem enables us to sit back and let people of color take very real risks of invalidation and retaliation as they share their experiences. But we are not required to take similar cross-racial risks. Not we, have race, and thus they are holders of racial knowledge. In this way, we position ourselves as standing outside hierarchical social relations. White flight may be seen as another aspect of white racial innocence, as it is often justified by beliefs that people of color, again, especially black people, are more prone to crime, and that if, quote, too many black people move into a neighborhood, crime will increase. Home values will go down and the neighborhood will deteriorate. For examples, in a study of race and perceptions of crime conducted by sociologists Heather Johnson and Thomas Shapiro, white families consistently discussed fear of crime and associated crime with people of color. In their minds, the more people of color in an area, specifically blacks and Latinos, the more dangerous the area was perceived to be. Research matching census data and police department crime statistics show that this association does not hold. But these statistics do not quell white fears. For most whites, the percentage of young men of color in a neighborhood is directly correlated with perceptions of the neighborhood's crime level. Deeply held white associations of black people with crime distort reality and the actual direction of danger that has historically existed between whites and blacks. The vast history of extensive and brutal explicit violence perpetrated by whites and their ideological rationalizations are all trivialized through white claims of racial innocence. The power we now yield and have yielded for centuries is thus obscured. I'm going to pause there so that way I can break up the video. So stay tuned for part 2 of chapter 4.